And don't just label it, understand it. Love you, Bernie. I really do. In fact, I actually made my own Vote Sanders sign for my front lawn during the primary. Still, I cringe on a daily basis as my Facebook friends and YouTube commenters remind me that some of the Vermont senators' views are a tad less than perfectly scientific. So it bothered me a bit when I read a recent post by Senator Sanders on Facebook, where he said,
82% of the American people believe that labeling should take place with regard to genetically engineered ingredients. All over this country, increasingly, people are concerned about the quality of the food they are ingesting and the food that they are giving to their kids. People want to know what is in their food. The requirement of labeling genetically modified food exists today in dozens and dozens of countries throughout the world.
No, I'm not going to cover well-trodden ground to defend GMOs here. Neil deGrasse Tyson, Bill Nye, Kevin Folta, and Norman Borlaug have all done better jobs than I ever could. Even an old Penn and Teller show has covered it. If you really want an easily understandable, well-reasoned, and scientifically informed explanation, check out this Miles Power video. He has several excellent videos, and I won't try to do better than an actual scientist. I want to talk instead about the question I often find myself trying to answer, one that Miles and company have mostly left unanswered. One that may not be best answered by a scientist. I want to address just one question people have asked over and over and has not been answered by many people on either side of the debate. I want to address Bernie's question. Why not just label? Here's the thing. I used to think everyone understood certain things about how our food is produced, processed, stored, and transported. I think there are 3 really good reasons many people, reasonable people, not just big business, don't want mandatory labeling laws, similar to the one his state has enacted. Number 1, package and sales considerations. A label is actually pretty cheap. You can buy a bit of gummy paper or print one off on a computer or just change your printer settings, right? Well, no. First, an official label isn't just any old bit of sticky paper. The Vermont plan allows a good deal more leniency than some others, but usually labels are of a designated size, color, font, style, and design. Take the label for USDA approved raw meat. It looks like this. Or actually, that's just one way it could look. It's going to depend on a lot of things. Raw meat actually has to be stamped with an inspection stamp on the carcass and be labeled on any packaging. If it is processed in any way, it gets another inspection sticker. Cooked gets another, and it gets marked for grade. Plus, it has to have handling instructions printed on the package. Now, these are mandatory labels required by the USDA. There are others that are strictly voluntary, like the one for humanely treated poultry or the one for kosher foods. Well, actually there are lots of them for kosher foods. Some voluntary labels are overseen by USDA. These are the USDA certified programs like Certified Organic or GMO Free. Even though it is entirely up to the seller, maker, or packager whether to put a voluntary label on their product, if they want to include it, they have to meet program guidelines. That's why many companies with products that might actually be organic or GMO free may not label that way. It's just a lot of hoop jumping. If they don't see it as benefiting them to include the label, then they often won't. For instance, if you don't think anyone wants kosher ketchup, then you probably won't waste time and money putting it on your label. But if you've already gone to the trouble of paying the certifier and meeting all the requirements, putting it on the label usually will make you a bit of extra money. In this case, because Jewish people that observe kosher will buy yours over a brand that doesn't have certification. Thus, markets drive who puts voluntary labels on their products. Well, it's already getting more complicated, isn't it? I mean, will you make more money selling free-range eggs than the cost of actually raising chickens in a way that meets USDA requirements? Will your customers be willing to pay extra for whatever advantage the label confers? Any label that the USDA oversees, whether voluntary or mandatory, has to be approved by the USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Services. And that's not as easy as it seems. Lots of new ones are created all the time, but lots more don't get approved because the rules are so difficult to follow. It's a burdensome process. Once the label gets approved, it doesn't get changed. You can't create your own meat inspection sticker, for example. You can change some aspects, but others are hard and fast. You can't make it too big, too small, the wrong colors, or the wrong font. You can't change their circles to squares. In some cases, you can't even pick your own kind of sticker or stamp, but have to use the very specific style they require. If the approved stamp is of edible ink, it must be in edible ink on your package. If it is approved only for indelible ink, you can't substitute a temporary ink. And they aren't kidding. Why? Because this is regulatory. It has the force of law behind it. If you want your program certification managed by the USDA, or FDA, or EPA, then you have to accept that means they will have to make regulations that can be applied across the board to everyone and be enforced. Now, if your product is super small, adding an inch-wide label may completely obscure your product or its label. If you spent a few $1,000s having your packaging designed by a professional agency, changing it to accommodate a label you may not need could be costly, both in terms of paying additional fees and in terms of its ability to sell your product in a sea of similar products. And if your labels are usually printed of a material in a color or with an ink that doesn't qualify, you may have to change your entire label, not just add a tiny design element. People who invest in a label for their product do not want to spend more money redesigning them, even if that design is of questionable value to begin with. Jody Schechter? But aside from the issues of the physical label is the question of what the label is telling us. What are you conveying when you say your product is cruelty-free or fair trade? These are pretty positive messages. I think most of us would agree. If I don't care whether my chocolate is fair trade, then I'll just ignore this label and select whatever candy or baking chocolate that happens to appeal to me for other reasons. But if this is an issue I think is important, I may seek out those with this label. What does GMO-free mean to you? What message does it convey? GMO-free is a phrase that producers can put on their food if they want to appeal to consumers who consider this an important issue. The USDA allows this wording, but doesn't recommend it. Their preferred verbiage is not bioengineered, not genetically engineered, not genetically modified through the use of modern biotechnology. There's also a non-governmental organization called the Non-GMO Project that provides certification that food producers can apply for the same purpose. This is a USDA approved label, but it is overseen by a non-governmental agency. What message do you get when you see this label on your food? If you're like most people, you're going to make certain associations. It's green, which signals healthy, natural things. 2 of these labels even have plants, and one of them has a butterfly on it. But even more important is the word free. Usually, when we advertise that our food is free of something, we mean it doesn't have something that might be bad for us, or a contaminant. Good things that are absent from our food are usually cautions or warnings like, notice, this food contains less than the recommended daily intake of vitamin A. But things that we say our food is free of are things we want them to be free of. Free has a very happy connotation, doesn't it? Fat-free, cholesterol-free, sugar-free, contaminant-free, pesticide-free, gluten-free, or GMO-free certainly appeal to people who don't want those things. And they don't send a negative message to people who aren't concerned about GMOs, gluten, sugar, or fat. So these labels work the way they intend to. They might also work the way they aren't supposed to, by scaring people about things that actually aren't worrisome. My mom's a diabetic, so she occasionally needs to purchase sugar-free versions of her favorite foods. And I watch my weight and may do likewise. But someone who is avoiding sugar only because of a vague notion that sugar is bad isn't making an informed choice so much as acting on emotional triggers. Worse, if you buy sugar-free thinking it means lower calories, you may be exchanging calories from sugar with calories from fat and not benefiting at all. That's what labels do. They operate on our emotions. Similarly, many people have become convinced that gluten is something that should be avoided for general health, even though only a small percentage of people actually have celiac disease, the condition that makes gluten dangerous. Some people also have wheat allergies, and gluten-free foods may be one way to avoid wheat. But they aren't celiac sufferers and don't need gluten-free products so much as wheat-free. That label for them can be misleading. Gluten is in some grains other than wheat, and wheat proteins can contaminate foods that are certified gluten-free. So the gluten-free label isn't exactly specific enough to really help people with wheat allergies. Products that are labeled the same tend to get shelved together at grocery stores. Have you noticed that? Does your store have a health food section? How about a snack food section? Foreign foods is a section most commissaries have, and I've noticed it in a few grocery stores over the years too. Some stores go further and have sections for gluten-free foods or sugar-free or diabetic foods or any number of categories, breaking them down into smaller and smaller groups. A GMO-free label would likely be treated the same. They can either give GMO-free foods an added boost or work against them by placing them in a sort of in-store ghetto where shoppers never go unless they are specifically looking for that particular label. I mean, when was the last time you went down the foreign foods row anyway? Deciding whether your product should be separated that way is an important marketing decision. And it's not one that may be in your hands in every case. If keeping your product out of the icky foods aisle means not labeling, many companies might decide no label is the way to go. And this is the positive label, remember? The happy green butterfly on the label. We haven't even mentioned the more ominous may contain GMOs or made with genetically engineered ingredients type labels. Reason number 2. Misleading and unscientific labels don't inform the consumer. How does that apply to GMOs? Oh boy. So let's look at that label again. GMO free. So, as I said, the FDA doesn't actually like this wording, even though it's allowed. There are some good reasons why it's not the preferred way to say it. It just doesn't mean anything. It's not precise, and it's a tad misleading. GMO stands for genetically modified organism. Here's what Google says an organism is: an individual animal, plant, or single-celled life form. Synonyms include living thing, being, creature, animal, plant, life form, fish, and other organisms. It could also mean the material structure of an individual life form, the heart's contribution to the maintenance of the human organism, or a whole with interdependent parts, likened to a living being, the upper strata of the American social organism. Need I point out that the tomato is not an organism? The tomato plant is an organism. The tomato is part of that organism, in the same way you are an organism, but your fingernail is not. The FDA also lists the following phrases as being acceptable. We do not use ingredients that were produced using modern biotechnology. This oil is made from soybeans that were not genetically engineered. Our corn growers do not plant bioengineered seeds. These phrases make it clear that what is genetically altered is the plant, not the resulting product, and that we aren't just talking about modifying them, but engineering them in vitro. If we use the term GMO, we are actually referring to any organism modified at the genetic level. So traditional cross-pollination, chemical alterations of seeds, or bombarding them with radiation would all qualify. So technically that tomato plant would be a GMO. Oil made from GE soybeans is correct usage. GMO soybean oil isn't. It's that simple. A soybean is not an organism, and oil is most definitely not an organism. Even if we pretend the term GMO actually properly applies to food made with GMO organisms, rather than only to the organisms themselves, we still have the problem of the perception of the label. Saying that some food is GMO free is implying that GMOs are something we would rather not have in our food. And while others may have made a better argument than I could ever hope to about whether GMOs are good or bad, the assumption that GMOs are something we'd rather not have in our food is definitively wrong. That is, by definition, it is wrong. Why? Because GMOs cannot be in your food. They are the food. Just like an identical twin is a clone is not in an identical twin. If the tomato plant is the organism, you can't put it in the tomato, now can you? If anything, we should say GMOs have been reduced so as to make your food. We've cut the tomato from the vine, sliced it up, cooked it, and added salt, spices, and vinegar to make your sauce. You're welcome. So how should we feel about this phrasing required under Vermont law? Produced with genetic engineering. Partially produced with genetic engineering. Okay, I'm going to ignore the fact that you can't partially produce something with genetic engineering. That makes no sense. And just talk about what they sound like. I don't find them particularly alarming. I don't know about you. But then again, I know what a GMO is and isn't. And I like GMOs in a general sort of way. These phrases at least don't claim that you are eating the entire tomato plant, root and stem. You aren't eating an organism, just something made with the help of technology that modifies organisms. For me, the problem is that they tell me nothing of any real use beyond that. Yes, they were made with genetic engineering. Which sort? Wait, you didn't know there are different sorts? Oh yeah, I looked it up. My Google Scholar foo is strong. Here are some of the processes which are lumped under the general heading of genetic engineering. Wait for it. Microbial vectors. Yeah, a naturally occurring genetic engineering agent such as agrobacterium transfers DNA into plant cells. Or microprojectile bombardment. Naked DNA is delivered to a plant's cells by shooting them with microscopic pellets to which DNA has been adhered. Okay, that sounds significantly more Star Wars than I was expecting. Then there's electroporation. Plant protoplasts take up macromolecules from their surrounding fluid, facilitated by an electrical impulse. So that, yeah, they're shocking the little plant GMO. Hey, I didn't make this up. Then there's microinjection. This is the one I was actually imagining. I'm kind of ignorant. DNA is injected directly into anchored cells, and then some proportion of these cells survive and integrate the injected DNA. It's actually not a very efficient system. So surprisingly, or maybe not so surprisingly, it's not used all that often. Transposons, or transposable elements, are genes of most plant and some animal species that have short, naturally occurring pieces of DNA with the ability to move from one location to another in the genome. It hasn't actually been used yet for commercial applications yet. The last one that I have is transduction. This is when a bacteriophage is used to move DNA from one strain into another, and it's actually used far more often than you might think. So, which one was used to create the stuff you're eating? Most likely microbial vectors, but microprojectile bombardment is especially helpful with cereal grains like corn, according to these guys, who should know better than I. Okay, so let's say you know how they emmed the G of your O. Why? Why would they do that? Well, what was the purpose of adding the new DNA segment? Or suppressing it, or duplicating, or deleting, or whatever? A lot of attention is focused on making them resistant to pests, or the stuff that kills those pests. That's the Bt endotoxins, Bt corn, for instance, or the Roundup Ready corn and other products that you've heard so much about. I can almost kind of see why people might fear ingesting a plant that is designed to resist bugs. Okay, look, here in the United States, not many humans eat sorghum, but in the rest of the world, lots of people do. But even here in the US, horses, for instance, don't seem to mind eating completely non-GMO, green bug-resistant hybrid sorghum. Yeah, it really exists. There's a hybrid sorghum that resists green bugs, which is great because apparently green bugs, though they sound very familiar and fun and happy, yeah, they're green, they kill sorghum. So yeah, I don't think the horses want to eat green bugs, but they don't seem to mind these green bug resistant hybrids. And for some reason, neither do the groups that want to label GMOs. No one seems to mind them. In fact, I don't even see anybody talking about them. Okay, there's another case. How about this? There's this weed called Arabidopsis thaliana. Yeah, Latin words, huh? It's a kind of mustard. A wild mustard, right? It can attract friendly bugs to come and eat the bad plant killer bugs. Ugh. Thanks to a gene from, drumroll please, a strawberry plant. So, there's an interesting GE test case. I can see where people wouldn't want to eat a naturally bug-resistant plant, even if it is just a wild mustard crossed with a strawberry plant. I know, Flint Lockwood. Keep that thing back. It can call bug bodyguards. But what if the trait it was providing was production of less of a chemical that causes cancer and turns your potato black? Wouldn't that be something people would want to eat? Bottom line then, genetic engineering is the manipulation in some way of DNA. One might suppress parts, delete parts, add parts, duplicate existing parts, or combine parts. One might add DNA from within the same species, And this is how the Arctic apples were made, for instance. Different apples had different favored traits. Combining them brought a non-browning apple that tastes great. It's hard to see how an Arctic apple is somehow more threatening than any other hybrid apple. Two apples are mated to produce a new one with DNA from both parent apple trees. Big whoop, as my kid would say. Or they might take DNA from similar species, the way the Aqua Advantage salmon was created using our DNA from a Chinook salmon and an ocean pout. Of course, they can use vastly different species too, as when a goat is modified to produce medicine for humans. Which one of these needs to be labeled? So, it would seem to be the DNA is what makes it a GMO, right? So, what about products derived from GMOs that contain no DNA, or none of the DNA that was modified, or only a tiny amount of fragmentary DNA? Soy is a common GMO. Nearly all of the soy in the US is from GM stock. Soybeans contain GE, genetically engineered DNA. And tofu from those soybeans also contain genetically engineered DNA. It's one way countries that ban GMOs can test to determine if you've cheated and sent them some of their nasty modified stuff. But soy lecithin contains only trace amounts of fragmentary DNA. Still GMO? Okay, what about rapeseed oil? The rapeseed is GE, but the oil contains not even trace amounts of DNA. How would you know if the rapeseed oil you are using even came from GMOs? Oh, the label, you say. The label that tells you nothing useful. It didn't even tell us what method they used, or what traits they were selecting for, or whether the traits came from the same species or another one. And there's none of the DNA left. Wow, that was helpful. Not. The third reason, the real costs are hidden. If you can slap a new label on without too much cost, and you don't care that the new label is nothing but a panacea for people who don't understand science, then you really have no reason to object to labeling, right? Well, this is law, remember? It has the force of law behind it. Let's take a look at what it says. Commingle. Commingle means permitting physical contact between unpackaged food produced without genetic engineering and unpackaged food produced with genetic engineering during production, processing, transportation, storage, or handling, other than during the manufacture of a multi-ingredient product containing both types of food. Unpackaged food in a closed container identifying as produced without genetic engineering is not commingled while the container is intact. Whew. But wait, there are some exemptions and exceptions. Let's check those out. Here's what the law says. The following food shall not be subject to the labeling requirements of Section 3043 of this title. 2. A raw agricultural commodity or processed food derived from it that has been grown, raised, or produced without the knowing or intentional use of food or seed produced with genetic engineering. Food will be deemed to be as described in this subdivision only if the person otherwise responsible for complying with the requirements of subsection 3043A of this title with respect to raw agricultural commodity or processed food obtains from whoever sold the raw agricultural commodity or processed food to that person a sworn statement that the raw agricultural commodity or processed food has not been knowingly or intentionally produced with genetic engineering and, drumroll, has been segregated from and has not been knowingly or intentionally commingled with food that may have been produced with genetic engineering at any time. Apparently, Senator Sanders et al. Believe that allowing a GMO salmon steak to sit next to a non-GMO trout will lead to GMO DNA leaping off the salmon, impregnating the trout, and reproducing little fish fillets. Possibly. Instead, they view GMOs like diseases, where one can contaminate the other, passing on the disease, like unvaccinated children in Disneyland passing along the measles. Yeah. Let's say you are a cookie and energy bar seller on the internet, with your own web page and a location in Texas. Now, you don't mill your own flour, and you certainly do not grow your own wheat, corn, etc. So you are trying to comply with the law. You contact the wholesaler that sells you your corn flour. Is y'all's corn flour GMO free under Vermont law definition? Now, our wholesalers in New Jersey, they don't know, so they call the mill that bulk processes it for them. Is the flour you guys send us GMO free or what? The mill says they're pretty sure it is, but they receive grain shipments from all over the US, Canada, and Mexico. They send an email to the 3 co-ops who ship corn to their mill. We are receiving requests for compliance certificates from Vermont food suppliers, NRE, the GMO law. Please send certifications of GMO-free status ASAP this office. Not certified, please see attached copy of law for guidance in drafting sworn statement of same. No more corn will be accepted this mill until we are in full compliance. He gets back certificates or sworn statements from about half the people who ship him corn for milling. He contacts you and tells you he just can't guarantee that all the corn that is processed at his mill is 100% GMO free, because some trucks and rail cars are used to haul both GM corn and non-GM corn, and they aren't always thoroughly washed and inspected between shipments. Technically, they can't say they have definitely segregated and avoided commingling along the entire supply chain. Sorry! Good luck in the cookie business. Now what do? You have 3 options. Bad, worse, and that's the way the cookie crumbles. Bad. You label your product may be produced with genetic engineering, per the law. You have no choice. You can't prove that it isn't, but it isn't. It really, really isn't. Your wholesaler and his mill and their supplying farmers all tried their best, but complying with this law is a real bear. Now, consumers will not be buying your GMO-free cookies anymore. You could still sell to all the people who don't care if they may be made with genetic engineering. Could be worse. Worse. You label them GMO-free and you take your chances. Someone reads your website and sees that you buy from Happy-Go-Lucky Natural Corn Wholesale Company. Wait a minute. They remember someone suing Happy-Go-Lucky for their Happy-Go-Lucky ways with organic certification. Realizing this means your cornmeal and sorghum energy bars are made with their flour, these nosy people turn you in. You either hire a lawyer and hope they are really good, or you pay the fine of not more than $1,000 per day per product. You have 6 SKUs. That's up to $6,000 per day. Either way, your all-natural cookie and energy bar business is going belly up. Nice knowing you. Crumbles. You could decide not to label. Say, to heck with Vermont, and pull your product from their stores. You won't be alone. Large and small manufacturers and suppliers have done just that recently. Coca-Cola just announced that they will not be shipping some of their products into the state, at least for the time being. Coke can afford that decision. I hope you don't make a lot of your money off your Vermont buyers. C'est la vie. Now, if you choose option 1 and label your product may be produced with genetic engineering per the law, Vermont has another kick in the profits for you. They've gone ahead and superseded federal regulations once more. Here's what their law says. The manufacturer of a food that is produced entirely or partially with genetic engineering and offered for retail sale in Vermont shall not make any statement about the food that contains the word natural or any of the words or similar import in advertising or in the retail premises, on signs identifying the product at the point of display in the retail premises, or on the label of the food. What does natural mean? If you haven't read my earlier blog post about my own efforts to pin down the definition, you can click over there now. I'm not going through it again. The FDA has pretty much given up on defining it. How much do you want to bet that at least some of those companies opting not to label have something about natural or nature on their packaging? I need to pay the phone bill, so I'm taking all bets. Yet Vermont, all by themselves, decided that the FDA was wrong. Well, I agree, but in the opposite direction. Look, if GMOs are unnatural, so is cooking oil, regardless of its origin. Certainly, potato chips in a bag have got to be artificial by any definition. I'm just not going through this again. It'll make your head hurt. People who define natural as, I don't know what it is, but I'll know it when I see it, have it as much right as the FDA or anyone else. You might as well tell them that they aren't allowed to put made with love on the label. It has exactly that much meaning. But here it is in the law, as if Bernie Sanders or anyone else has actually ever defined what natural means. If we're going to label, let's not do it one stupid state at a time. Look guys, this is America in 2016. We don't buy only food produced the next town over. We buy food that not only is made or packaged the next state over, but which contains ingredients from all over the country or even all over the world. Cacao from Africa or South America, blended with sugars from Louisiana, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico, vanilla from Mexico, hazelnuts from wherever hazelnuts grow, and soy lecithin from almost anywhere become the candy sold by the British company licensing the Swedish name and selling through the US chain store. Welcome to the future of food. Do you know where the corn that was used in your Frosted Flakes came from? Odds are, neither does Kellogg's. Kellogg's has stated they will label their products, but they're doing it on a national basis, and they are urging a single federal standard. I think that makes sense. It's hard enough to get Mexico and US on the same page. Getting all 50 states plus our territories and protectorates to agree on labeling rules is a Herculean task. That's why we have an FDA, USDA, and EPA. They decide what standards the whole country will follow. Congress saw the need to establish the Interstate Commerce Clause specifically to prevent this kind of confusing nonsense. The current law that just went into effect is hurting consumers in many of the ways skeptics like me warned it would. So even if you don't care about science, or a fair shot for small businesses, or even constitutional law, maybe you'll care that you can't buy your favorite Coke product, or infant formula, or snack food. If these reasons weren't compelling enough, maybe we can talk about those pesky cool labels next time, yeah?